Back in 2016, Lindsey said something rather nasty on his flight to becoming the next president of the United
Under the
States.
stone arches of Washington National Cathedral, with two sitting heads of state watching from the pews, Donald Trump stood over the casket of his closest ally in the Senate and did something almost nobody expected. He laughed. Then he told a story about the two of them that started with a public humiliation and ended, somehow, with a decade of friendship. But buried inside that eulogy was something else, too, something that sounded less like grief and more like a confession. For years, people whispered about what Lindsey Graham really was to Donald Trump, and what Donald Trump really thought of Lindsey Graham. In front of the whole world, at a funeral, Trump finally said the quiet part out loud. Let's get into it. To understand why that eulogy landed the way it did, you have to go back almost a decade, to the chaos of the 2016 Republican primary. Back then, Trump and Graham were not friends. They were not even friendly. They were two men chasing the same nomination, throwing elbows at each other in front of cameras, and the fight got personal fast. It started, as a lot of things did in that primary, with John McCain. When Trump questioned whether McCain counted as a war hero, Graham, who considered McCain one of his closest friends in the Senate, went on television and called Trump a jackass. That is not typical political language between two people running in the same primary. It was a direct, personal insult, and Trump does not usually let those slide. So Trump did what Trump does. At a rally in South Carolina, he stood in front of a crowd, brought up the insult, and then pulled out a slip of paper. On it was Graham's actual personal cell phone number. He read it aloud, more than once, on camera, to a stadium full of people who then had every incentive in the world to dial it themselves. Predictably, Graham's phone lit up. His voicemail filled up within hours. Whether people called out of outrage, curiosity, or just because they'd been dared to, it did not matter. Graham's private line had become a punchline, and his campaign was furious. This was not some abstract political jab. This was one candidate exposing another candidate's personal information to millions of strangers, live, without warning. Graham did not take it lying down, either. He later filmed himself smashing a cell phone to classical music, a strange but very online way of saying he was done being anyone's punchline. On paper, this looked like the kind of feud that follows two people for the rest of their careers. Graham's own campaign manager said as much at the time, framing the stunt as proof that Trump wasn't fit to be commander-in-chief. Nobody watching that rally would have predicted these two men standing shoulder to shoulder a decade later. And yet, somewhere between that rally and Trump's inauguration, the relationship flipped. According to Graham himself, not long after the phone number incident, the two men actually sat down and talked. And by the end of that meeting, Graham reportedly handed Trump a new cell number. After everything that had just happened, he voluntarily gave Trump another way to reach him. From there, Graham became one of the most visible Trump allies in Washington. He stood behind Trump through impeachment hearings. He fought for Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation in a way that many considered one of the most memorable moments of his Senate career. He was a constant presence at Trump's side through nearly every defining fight of his presidency, at a time when plenty of other Republicans were choosing their words far more carefully. That kind of loyalty is not accidental. And at the funeral, Trump himself connected the dots. He told the room that the whole phone number disaster was, in his words, something he probably shouldn't have done, but that Graham got the last laugh. Because while Trump blew up Graham's phone for one single day, Graham didn't stop calling him for the next 10 years. 10 years. From the man whose number he broadcast to the entire country. It's one of those stories that sounds made up until you remember it happened in full public view, covered by news cameras at every step. Graham died suddenly on July 11th at 71 years old, after suffering an aortic dissection, a tear in the wall of the aorta that can turn fatal within hours if not treated immediately. He had just returned from a trip to Ukraine, a fitting final chapter for a senator who had spent years deeply invested in the war there and in Kiev's fight against Russia. His death sent a shockwave through the Capitol. This was not a quiet backbencher. Graham had spent decades in the Senate, years before that in the House, and years in uniform before politics ever entered the picture. He served more than 6 years on active duty as an Air Force lawyer, then continued in the South Carolina Air National Guard and later the Air Force Reserves, eventually retiring as a colonel. Few politicians in Washington had lived quite so many full careers inside one lifetime. So when the funeral arrangements came together, it was never going to be a small affair. Graham's casket passed through the Capitol first, carried by an armed forces honor detail. From there it moved to Washington National Cathedral for an invitation-only service that pulled together an extraordinary list of names. Vice President J.D. Vance was there. So was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who had served alongside Graham in the Senate, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Eric Trump and Lara Trump attended as well. It didn't stop at American politics. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew in. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did too, having reportedly met with Graham himself just days before his death. Think about what that means. A funeral for one United States senator pulled in sitting heads of state from two countries in the middle of active wars. That alone tells you how much international weight Graham quietly carried behind the scenes for years, cultivating relationships most Americans never saw play out. Fox News host Sean Hannity delivered a eulogy that day too, alongside Graham's niece, Emil Lieboggs Roberts. As the casket was carried out of the cathedral to the sound of a military band, Trump reportedly stopped to comfort Graham's sister, holding her hand and kissing her cheek before the procession continued on to South Carolina, where a second service and burial took place the following day in Graham's home county. And somewhere in the middle of all that ceremony, Trump stepped up to deliver the eulogy that would end up defining the day. Trump opened the way most eulogies open. He called Graham a beloved friend, a devoted brother, a respected statesman, a giant of the Senate. He said Graham was a true American original who left far too soon. Standard stuff, exactly what you'd expect from any politician honoring a longtime colleague. Then it got less standard. Trump brought the room back to 2016, to the insult Graham had thrown at him, and to his own response, sharing Graham's private number with a crowd of strangers. He called it something he probably shouldn't have done, then turned it into the origin story of their friendship, joking that Graham got the last laugh by calling him nonstop for the next decade. In front of Graham's actual family, in front of foreign heads of state, Trump used the most chaotic chapter of their relationship as a punchline at his funeral. He also used the eulogy to talk about Kavanaugh's confirmation fight, calling Graham's defense of the nominee maybe his finest hour in the Senate. He threw in one more classic Trumpicide, joking that virtually everyone, Republican or Democrat, liked Lindsey, before catching himself and adding that not everybody did, but it sounded good anyway, and that Graham was a tough cookie regardless. But the eulogy itself wasn't really the part that set off the most conversation. It was everything happening around it. Around the same time as the funeral, Trump gave an interview to NBC's Kristen Welker on Meet the Press, and in it, he described what may have been his final conversation with Graham. According to Trump, Graham called him in the early evening on the night he died, not long after landing from his trip to Ukraine. Trump said Graham sounded tired, but otherwise fine, and that the call was mostly about the Save America Act, an election bill focused on requiring proof of citizenship and photo identification for voting, a bill that has struggled to find enough votes in the Senate. Trump described Graham as telling him they were all set, and that they even talked about meeting up the next day. Hours later, Graham was gone. Trump framed it as a genuinely emotional moment, a devoted lawmaker working right up until the end. And in fairness, multiple outlets that spoke to people close to the situation reported similar details. So there's no real dispute that the call happened or that Graham discussed the bill. Where things get more complicated is in how that story was used. Critics pointed out that the Save America Act happens to be one of Trump's top legislative priorities, one that has repeatedly failed to clear the Senate, turning Graham's final hours into a scene where a dying senator's last real concern was pushing that exact bill struck some observers as awfully convenient timing for a piece of stalled legislation. To be clear, nobody has presented evidence that the conversation didn't happen the way Trump described it. But the optics of using a friend's final moments to build momentum for a controversial bill did not sit well with everyone watching. And Trump didn't stop there. In that same Welker interview, He was asked who should fill Graham's now vacant Senate seat. He said he already had someone in mind, someone he thought would be great, though he wasn't ready to name them yet. Under South Carolina law, that decision belongs solely to Governor Henry McMaster. Yet before Graham had even been laid to rest, the sitting president was already signaling, publicly, that he intended to have a say in who came next. For a lot of observers, that one comment crystallized what people had suspected about Trump's relationships in Washington for years, that even genuine friendships often come wrapped in political calculation. Maybe the most talked about single line from the eulogy came when Trump described Graham as extremely hawkish, adding that he never saw a war he didn't like. Trump followed it up by saying only Graham's true friends would really understand that, and that Graham believed, in his bones, that America's destiny was to win, and that his job was to make sure the country's enemies lost. On one level, this wasn't exactly a hot take. Graham had spent decades as one of the Senate's loudest voices for military intervention and a strong American presence abroad. Anyone who followed his career already knew this about him. In some ways, Trump was just saying the quiet part everyone already believed. But saying it at a funeral in front of the actual family produced a very different reaction than saying it on cable news. Sean Hannity, who delivered his own eulogy that same day, pushed back on the framing almost immediately. Hannity argued that Graham had been unfairly branded a warmonger for years, and that what Graham actually wanted was lasting peace, especially across the Middle East. He pointed to Graham's personal relationships with leaders like Netanyahu and Zelensky as proof that Graham's instincts were about stability, not conflict for its own sake. Graham's own sister reportedly echoed that same pushback in a separate conversation, saying her brother did not love war. She said he loved peace and wanted wars to end, but understood that sometimes conflict becomes unavoidable. In follow-up interviews after the service, when reporters brought Trump's line back up, he reportedly didn't really engage with the criticism at all. He just moved on to the next question. So you had two very different portraits of the same man delivered in the same room on the same day. Trump painting Graham as someone who simply loved to fight. Hannity and Graham's own family insisting that framing missed the point entirely, that Graham's real legacy was chasing peace, not chasing war. That split matters, because Hannity wasn't some random speaker filling a slot. He was one of Graham's closest friends outside the Senate floor for decades. When someone that close to the man uses his own eulogy to correct another eulogy that had just wrapped up minutes earlier, it's hard not to notice. Step back, and the whole day reads like a perfect summary of what the Trump-Graham relationship actually was. There was real grief in that eulogy. You could hear it when Trump called Graham a force of nature he would miss deeply. But Trump also could not resist reaching for the most chaotic chapter of their history, the leaked phone number, and turning it into a laugh line at a funeral. That tension between genuine loss and Trump's instinct to turn even the most solemn moments into something with an edge is, frankly, on brand for both men. Graham spent his entire career being labeled a hawk who loved to fight, and even in death, that label followed him straight into his own funeral, sparking a real-time defense from the person who probably knew him best outside of politics. There's also a bigger question hiding underneath all of this, about how public grief works when the person being mourned lived such a loud, larger-than-life career. Graham was never a quiet background senator. He made headlines constantly, picked fights, and threw himself into foreign policy debates with more energy than almost anyone else on the Hill. Maybe it makes sense, then, that his funeral wasn't a perfectly scripted, sanitized affair either. A few uncomfortable jokes and some pointed pushback from his own eulogy speakers might actually be a fitting way to send off someone who spent his whole career being anything but predictable. Meanwhile, the political machine kept moving. With Graham's seat now open, a field of candidates has already started lining up for a special primary, including a former governor, sitting members of Congress, and even Graham's own younger sister. Washington rarely pauses for grief for very long, and even the middle of honoring a 30-year career, the race to replace him was already underway before the flowers had wilted. And there's something worth sitting with in the fact that this funeral doubled as a genuine moment of global diplomacy. You don't get sitting leaders from Israel and Ukraine flying in for just anyone. Graham spent years building those relationships personally, showing up in those countries, picking up the phone, doing the slow, unglamorous work of building trust. Even in death, he pulled people from very different corners of the world into the same room. That's not something many individual politicians ever managed to pull off, whatever you think of how he did it. So, where does that leave us? A phone number stunt that somehow became a decade-long friendship. A final phone call that some see as a heartfelt goodbye, and others see as a conveniently timed political story. An eulogy that praised a man's convictions, while his own family and closest friend spent the same afternoon trying to correct the record on what those convictions actually were. It's a lot to unpack from one funeral, but maybe that's fitting for a man who spent 30 years making sure nobody ever had a simple, uncomplicated opinion of him. What do you think? Was Trump's account of that final phone call a genuine tribute to a devoted senator, or a politically convenient story used to push a stalled bill and shape who comes next? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns like this one, make sure you're subscribed.